As is the case with all the content on this channel, I did not use any AI tools in the writing, research, or editing for this video. September 2nd, 1945 was a clear day on Tokyo Bay. Anchored before the Japanese capital was the American battleship the USS Missouri, a mighty vessel completed in late 1944. Aboard the ship that early September day, alongside the Japanese and American parties, were the delegations of all the formerly Allied nations gathered to sign the official Japanese Declaration of Surrender, ending the war in the Pacific and the Second World War. For such a famously proud nation as Japan, this was not only the day of ultimate surrender, but also the day of ultimate humiliation. Emperor Hirohito had already agreed to unconditional surrender to Allied forces 2 weeks earlier on August 15th. A week before that, the US had dropped 2 atomic bombs on the critical industrial and military centers of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Without those key cities, Japan's war effort was futile. Even the Japanese, often fighting to the last soldier, called it quits in the face of the unprecedented damage and suffering caused by the atomic bombs. Hirohito's unconditional surrender allowed the Allies, but primarily the United States, to occupy Japan post-war, much as had happened in Germany earlier that year. There was no end date to the occupation. It was to proceed until the time was deemed right, or at least until a formal peace treaty was signed. In total, the US occupation of Japan would last until 1951, with the signing of the Treaty of San Francisco. But 6 years earlier, with the signing of the surrender in Tokyo Bay in September 1945, nearly 9 decades of US policy towards Japan had come to its logical conclusion, with America in the driver's seat, literally molding the society as they saw fit. This sense of completion or fulfillment of some preordained destiny towards Japan was not lost on the leader of the U.S. delegation on the USS Missouri, General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander of U.S. forces in the Pacific during World War II. MacArthur had arranged for a special memento to be installed on the Missouri for that fateful day. Over in the corner, behind those iconic photos of Japanese, American, British, and French leaders signing the Declaration, was a ratty old American flag featuring 31 stars, encased in a protective frame. It had been shipped at MacArthur's personal request from the U.S. Naval Academy at Annapolis, Maryland, where it had been on display for 92 years. The flag belonged to a distant relative of MacArthur's. A man who has maybe more than any other American before General Mack had a foundational impact on the trajectory of the Japanese nation. The flag had once been flown on the steam frigate USS Mississippi, the flagship piloted by Commodore Matthew Perry, when he, 92 years before, had forced the Japanese shogunate to end its centuries-long policy of isolation and to allow Western ships unfettered access into the Forbidden Islands. General MacArthur even made reference to what is known as the Perry Expedition in his official speech before the delegation on the gun deck. He exclaimed, quote, "We stand in Tokyo today, reminiscent of our countryman Commodore Perry 92 years ago. His purpose was to bring Japan an era of enlightenment and progress by lifting the veil of isolation to the friendship, trade, and commerce of the world. But alas, the knowledge thereby gained of Western science was forged into an instrument of oppression and human enslavement." End quote. Given their shared kinship, MacArthur clearly viewed himself and Commodore Perry as kindred spirits, as the American evangelists coming to correct Japan's course back towards so-called enlightened principles. What was hiding behind this symbolic gesture and this harrowing speech was 9 decades of Japanese nation-building. In a little less than a century, Japan had gone from being a secluded stronghold of a bygone feudal warrior era to a global military superpower, fanatically challenging the British, Americans, and briefly Russians for domination of the entire Asian-Pacific Rim. Modern Japanese history often gets oversimplified, especially in the West. We are told stories of samurais overthrowing the shogun, miraculous industrial development, a fanatical ultranationalist spirit which took grip of the nation, and an unwavering expansionism which led to the ultimate day in Tokyo Bay. Within these images we find truth, of course, but we leave behind much of the nuance which provides the full picture of Japan's remarkable modernization and their ultimate showdown against the other great powers of the 1940s. Before we get into the even more overlooked US occupation of Japan post-war, I believe a detour is in order. The Japanese nation is ancient, but its modern history is comparatively young. 90 years, as I said before, divided its long-lasting feudal period and the final culmination of its military and colonial project. Many of the players who emerged during those decades of intense change would rear their ghostly faces during the occupation, as the Americans instrumentalized the very forces who had pushed Japan into total war. By studying this short 90-year period, we get a unique opportunity as history buffs to follow the close-knit familial clans from feudal despotism into capitalist oligarchy and finally into technocracy and the total war state. This evolution, which I will be focusing on intensely, I believe reveals many answers regarding the rush to war and, more importantly, the nature of the Japanese state after the US occupation and into modernity. Japan's rigid, hierarchical feudal system was abolished on paper in 1871, a couple of years after the fall of the shogun, but it remains in spirit in almost every facet of Japanese political life to this day. Before we dive in, I want to give a disclaimer. This may be self-evident, but I do still want to note that almost all the footage I will be using in this first Japan video will unfortunately have to be from fictionalized films and television shows depicting this era. As it stands, there is no known footage of Japan's samurai period, especially since the country was closed off, and film technology was still in its infancy, even in Europe and America. So we will have to do with modern depictions in films for this part. However, I did make a concerted effort to use samurai films that dealt specifically with the time period we will be covering, the Japanese Civil War and the Meiji Restoration. So although I usually try my hardest to find historical footage for these videos, this one will be an exception. Thank you for understanding, and now, let's get back to it.
I will do my level best to stand up for freedom and democracy around the world by keeping the United States of America strong and by keeping our eyes wide open as we welcome change in the world, but keeping our eyes wide open.
Before Commodore Perry's arrival in 1853, the Japanese shogunate was a largely untouched time capsule. For the past 250 years, the leadership in the capital, Edo, soon to be renamed to Tokyo, had maintained a strict policy of official isolation, known as sakoku. This was largely a measure to resist increased Western meddling in Asia. These foreigners were viewed in the Asian tradition as barbarians, looking to pry away the long-standing traditional way of life on the islands and impose Christianity on its population. Japan, as I have mentioned already, was ruled for the past 1,000 years by a shogun, which was a feudal military dictator of sorts, who derived his power in practice through his control of a mighty army. The shogun himself was arguably a divine figure to the Japanese people, but his divine rule in a legalistic sense, his mandate on power, in other words, was derived from the Son of Heaven himself, the Emperor, residing in his palace in Kyoto. Simply put, the divine emperor was for a time a figurehead and a political tool, used by the shoguns to legitimize their real power over Japanese society. Legends claim that the imperial dynasty of Japan, the Yamato dynasty, was started in the 1st century AD and still forms an unbroken bloodline to this day. The emperor had once been the true seat of power on the islands, with real political authority. But this had been some 650 or so years before Perry arrived on the Japanese shores, all the way back before 1192. Since then, the shoguns ruled supreme, using the emperor as a prop to rally the people around their earthly leadership. During those 600 or so years of dormancy, the imperial family and their entourage were confined to their palace grounds in the imperial capital of Kyoto, about 290 miles or 466 kilometers away from the shogun in Edo. Emperors and their court spent their days creating beautiful art, engaging in the ever-loved Japanese pastime of writing poetry, and spoke their own ancient Japanese dialect known as Gosho Kotoba, or palace language. In their book, The Yamato Dynasty, Sterling and Peggy Seagrave note that during those 650 years of shogun rule, quote, Most Japanese were unaware that emperors still existed, and only a small circle of court nobles continued to regard them as divine." End quote. To the average Japanese peasant, the emperor was more of an idea than an actual living man. Through him, real or imagined, the shogun, and thus the Japanese nation, was legitimized. For 285 years, Japan had followed a strict isolationist policy known as sakoku, as I previously mentioned. However, there did exist some minor exceptions to this otherwise ironclad rule. The Portuguese, and later the Dutch, were afforded a minuscule treaty port on a man-made island known as Dejima, off the coast of the southern city of Nagasaki, on the island of Kyushu. I should quickly talk about Japanese geography. The archipelago of Japan is made up of 4 main islands: Honshu, the largest central island, home to Edo and Kyoto; Shikoku, the smallest island, situated in Japan's inland sea; Hokkaido, the northernmost and least populated island, home to the indigenous Ainu people. It was not under shogunal control at the time of Perry's arrival in 1853. And finally, the southernmost island of Kyushu, of major importance to our studies today. Kyushu was home to Nagasaki, which was itself the host to Dejima, the only foreign trading port in the shogunate. This reality allowed the people of Nagasaki, and Kyushu more broadly, a unique opportunity to interact with Westerners. Most critically, this exclusive access to Europeans enabled the feudal lords of Kyushu to interface with Western military technology, i.e. guns, cannons, and eventually steam-powered warships. As the shogunate in faraway Edo began to decline into decadence and complacency, the feudal lords of Kyushu, primarily the Satsuma clan, and especially the adjacent Choshu domain across the Shimonoseki Straits on the main island of Honshu, took advantage of this special relationship that Nagasaki had with Western traders, and began to eclipse the shogun in strength. Commodore Perry's arrival in July of 1853 coincided with a time of intense instability in the shogunate. His mission was simple enough. President Millard Fillmore sent the Commodore to Japan to seek a new coaling station for ships bound for China. The Japanese islands formed a wall between the coast of California and the ever-profitable ports of eastern China. American steamers heading across the Pacific would benefit from a more convenient halfway port to restock on coal and supplies after the long journey. The U.S. eyed the small eastern Japanese island of Chichijima as the perfect location for a naval base. Far flung off the eastern coast of Japan, Chichijima was in the same island chain as Iwo Jima, the location of one of the most famous battles of the Pacific War, as we all know. But Perry's arrival in Edo Bay was met with the usual Japanese response. A few small shogunal boats met the American warship in the bay and politely asked them to leave. The Commodore would not accept this answer, threatening to bombard Edo if he did not get a meeting with relevant authorities. This type of hard-handed negotiations was nothing new. It was known as gunboat diplomacy, and was applied by the British, French, Dutch, Spanish, and Americans across the world in these times. Simply showing up at a country's port with a large steam-powered warship and a series of demands was enough to coax the otherwise unwilling country to acquiesce to the imperial power's demands. This type of hard-handed diplomacy was the source of significant resentment amongst the target countries, including the Japanese, of course. Perry's maneuver in 1853 and return to Edo in 1854 led to the signing of the Convention of Kanagawa, which officially allowed U.S. ships to dock at the ports of Shimoda and Hakodate, shattering the 220-year tradition of sakoku isolationism in one fell swoop. Soon enough, the British and the French would gain similar treaties, signaling the lighting of the fuse under the shogun's rule, as modernization and reform hit Japan in stride. Ironically, Perry's arrival in Japan and the subsequent opening of its society brought the most immediate benefit not to the Americans, but to the hegemonic British Empire, which was reaching its apex of power in the latter half of the 19th century. From the time of the Perry expedition until World War I, it would be the British, not the Americans, that would have the most substantial grip on Japanese affairs, immediately capitalizing on the newly unlocked market. Commodore Perry's forceful opening of Japan was not taken lightly by conservative elements of the Japanese aristocracy. Before the fall of the shogunate, Japan had been subdivided into a tapestry of competing minor noble holdings known as daimyos, with the small domain administrations known as hans. These feudal fiefdoms had comparatively small armies on their own, led by local military leaders, the famous samurai. Samurai differed from European knights in several key ways. Firstly, the samurai themselves often had small land holdings of their own, derived from favorable daimyos. This fusion between land ownership and a martial tradition placed the samurai at the intersection between capital interests and military interests. This unique combination of allegiances would follow the Japanese elite beyond the abolition of the Han system. During the tumultuous period following the opening of the Japanese economy and the restoration of the emperor as de jure leader of the country, the samurai came to occupy an increasingly influential position in national politics in Edo, as we will come to see. Increasingly disaffected samurai across Japan began to oppose the shogun following the humiliating standoff with Perry's gunboats. The most vocal and visible opposition to the shogun came from a small region of Japan that would come to dominate post-shogunal politics in the country and into modernity. If we zoom into the southwest of the islands, I want to highlight this critical choke point as the growing center of power in a rapidly modernizing Japan. As I mentioned briefly earlier, the waterway dividing Honshu, the main island, and Kyushu, the southernmost island, is called the Shimonoseki Straits, or the Kanmon Straits alternatively. This narrow passage beyond the Japanese islands and into the East China Sea was an essential artery from Pacific Japan into Korea and China. Control of the waterway meant control of shipments to and from mainland Asia, and eventually towards Japan's colonies in Korea, Manchuria, and China. Incidentally, it was also very easy to blockade, given that ships passing through would be sitting ducks to Japanese cannons on the beaches. But it was not the straits alone that made this particular area of Japan disproportionately powerful during the nation's modern period. I will remind you, the Kyushu city of Nagasaki was host to the only treaty port with the West until the opening of the country in 1854. Therefore, the surrounding samurai had access to European military technology far before the rest of the islands really had the opportunity to acquaint themselves with guns and artillery. Kyushu and the neighboring Choshu Han, right across the straits, were of special importance to Japan's industrialization and militarization. For one, Kyushu in particular contained the most significant coal deposits in Japan, excluding the northern island of Hokkaido and the southern Sakhalin Islands, which were far more remote and less populated than this region. The mines in Kyushu would represent the engine behind Japan's breakneck industrialization over the next century. The prominence of critical strategic resources on the island, notably coal, iron, and sulfur, entailed a disproportionate political influence in the upcoming oligarchy of the Meiji era of Japan. In this sense, Kyushu can be compared to Germany's Ruhr Valley, as the industrial base of raw materials necessary for rapid modernization. And right next door, the Choshu domain can be seen as Japan's Prussia, with its long-standing military tradition, wide class of skilled samurai, and the prominent future role that Choshu men would play in Japan's military bureaucracy. In short, Kyushu and neighboring Choshu were the engines that would drive Japanese industrial development and expansionism into the upcoming century. Ruling this ever-important region were two long-warring samurai clans, the Satsuma domain of Kyushu and the Choshu domain based in modern-day Yamaguchi, but at the time centered on Hagi Castle. For centuries, these two fiefdoms had been bitter rivals. But as two of the most traditional samurai clans, with little direct political influence to the faraway shogunal power center in Edo, they both saw an opportunity in the turmoil following Perry's expedition. The Tokugawa shogunate was on its last legs across Japan, but this was especially felt in the Satsuma and Choshu domains. With a long-standing warrior tradition and holding the most critical resources and choke point for Japan's industrialization, all that was needed now was to take control of the central government in the capital. Soon after the opening, the samurai lords of the West joined emperor loyalists in Kyoto in propagandizing a rallying call for the upcoming revolution. Soon, the streets were plastered with posters, and local shopkeepers and samurai could be heard chanting the words, Sonno Joy, translated to revere the emperor, expel the barbarians, the rallying cry of the upcoming civil war. Fundamental to this statement was the restoration of the caged bird, the emperor, to his former glory as the real leader of Japan, and not the detested shogun. This movement effectively turned a monarch into a veritable populist symbol, since the Japanese people knew little about the emperor, except for maybe the fact that he was a divine being in Kyoto. The Choshu, Satsuma, and eventually other samurai lords could create an image of the emperor that fit their specific political agenda of overthrowing the shogun. The emperor was thus portrayed as a traditional cleansing force, who would bring back order and good management to the decadent and corrupt government in Edo. But the second part of Sonno Joi, expel the barbarians, was somewhat disingenuous. This portion of the slogan was almost entirely propaganda. The lords of Choshu and Satsuma were more than happy to work with fellow British, French, and American business and banking interests during the Revolution, and especially once they took power in the capital. Cooperating with the West, especially the British Empire, would become the norm. Likely the second part of the Sonno Joi slogan was used as a rallying call to the conservative samurai across Japan, a reason to fight that fit nicely into Japan's isolated tradition. Although the hardliners, mostly rural samurai and peasants, were undoubtedly serious about reinstating Japan's isolationist policies, the men who did end up emerging from the Choshu and Satsuma clans after the fall of the shogunate were far more amiable to Western influence once they had control of the state. The benefits of Western collaboration were far too great to ignore, especially during Japan's remarkable modernization. On the ground outside of Edo, cries of Sonno Joi were heard from the peasant laborers up to the increasingly disaffected samurai lords. From the samurai clans of Western Honshu and Kyushu, the Sonno Joi movement hit close to home, as the Choshu domain was host to one of the country's leading intellectual forefathers of Japanese nationalism during this tumultuous time. Born in the outskirts of Hagi Castle in Choshu Domain, Yoshida Shoin's intellectual legacy can be seen far beyond his short 29-year life, which ended prematurely in 1859 when he was beheaded in Edo for seditious activity. From a low-ranking samurai farmer family, Shoin had a unique upbringing, with both his paternal uncles being scholars and his maternal uncle a Buddhist priest. Although samurai are primarily identified with military prowess, almost equally emphasized in their training was traditional education in literature, philosophy, and so-called military sciences. In this area, Yoshida Shoin excelled, quickly becoming a child prodigy. He was elevated at the age of 9 to a position as a, quote, pupil instructor at the Yamaga School of Military Arts and Strategy in Choshu Domain. That same year, he was elevated to full samurai status. For information regarding Yoshida Shoin, I pull from a PhD dissertation by Maida Coldrake, first published in 1984, which intricately details Shoin's life, thoughts, and legacy. I have linked it below. It is over 400 pages long and might as well be a full book on his subject. It's also quite well written. Coldrake claims that, quote, Shoin had no childhood. As soon as he came to the age of reason, he was already a man, end quote. He didn't know it at the time, but this quick coming of age at the age of 9 would be crucial, as he would only have 20 more years to cement his legacy before his head was put on the block. By the age of 18, Shoin was already a junior faculty member at the Meikan in Choshu, equivalent to a junior professor in modern times. From there, he dropped everything and spent his early adult years traveling throughout Japan, crossing some 11,000 kilometers on foot throughout his decade of adulthood. He first visited the adjacent island of Kyushu, just across the Shimonoseki Straits. There he learned about Western military technology, watching the Dutch ships entering the harbor at Nagasaki. He even paid a visit to Deshima, the only treaty port in Japan, where he boarded a Dutch ship and investigated its cannons. For the rest of his time as a vagrant across Japan, Shoin deepened his conviction that Japan's main weakness was its extensive coastlines. The solution: Japan needed to modernize its naval armada, and quickly. This was even before the Perry expedition plainly exemplified Japan's military shortcomings in the face of modern American warships. As it would have it, Shoin would be in Edo during the days of the second Commodore Perry visit in 1854, witnessing the so-called black ships in Shimoda Harbor, and seeing the shogunal forces scramble to come up with a response. It would be this short period in Edo during the second Perry visit that would most define Shoin's thoughts for the last and most prolific years of his life. He was elevated to the status of minor folk hero amongst the growing Sonno throngs when he and his fellow samurai friend Kaneko Shigenosuke borrowed a fishing ship from a sympathetic fisherman to go board Perry's ship and plead the case of a closed Japan. The pair succeeded and reached the deck of the foreign gunboat. They were welcomed by the U.S. Navy men as refugees at first, believing that they were trying to escape to the United States. In reality, they were there to sway Perry and his crew to return to America and to leave Japan alone. Once it was determined that these men were not seeking refuge, but were instead trying to sabotage the Kanagawa Treaty that had just been signed by Perry and the shogun's representatives, the interlopers were promptly brought back to shore. Ultimately, Shoin and his sidekick Kaneko Shigenosuke were arrested by Tokugawa forces and immediately imprisoned. This would mark the end of Shoin's free life, as he would spend his last 5 years on Earth either in jail or on house arrest. Ironically, these would also be his most productive and transformative years as an intellectual. After a short time in an Edo prison where he lectured to fellow prisoners and even on-duty guards, Yoshida Shoin was transferred back to his home region in the Choshu domain, where he spent a few more months in the prison at Hagi Castle. Soon enough, his sentence was commuted to house arrest, and he was to return to his hometown outside of the walls of the Hagi fortress. He returned to his birth family, the Sugis, and lived on their property for the rest of his life. On the Sugi premises was a minuscule one-room academy known as the Sonjuku. Since it was on the land that he was confined to during his house arrest, Shoin was allowed to teach at the Sonjuku. By this point, after years of traveling Japan, studying Neo-Confucian philosophy, specifically the thought of Mencius, and military science, Shoin was viewed as a master scholar. He was almost immediately elevated to principal of the small school. During his 3 years there, the academy rapidly expanded as students from across Choshu and the neighboring Satsuma domains fledged to the schoolhouse for lectures from the man who boarded Perry's black ship. Soon, as the academy grew, it took on its now famous name, the Shoka Sonjuku Academy. Shoin's ideological framework at the time is succinctly defined by Coldrake as a mix of anti-Western sentiments, emperor worship, and technological reverence, especially in the area of maritime warfare. This was a time when the shogunate was in a state of significant decline in the capital of Edo. The obviously humiliating Perry expedition coincided almost perfectly with a decisive erosion of the shogun's legitimacy, kicked off by the death of Shogun Tokugawa Ieyasu on July 27, 1853, only 2 weeks after Perry first arrived in Edo Bay. Ieyasu was succeeded by his son, Tokugawa Ieyasu, who was only 29 years old but was sickly and weak. He died childless, likely from cholera, in 1858. Leading to a major succession crisis. The Sonno activists and Choshu domain called for Tokugawa Yoshinobu to succeed the dead shogun. Yoshinobu was from a Tokugawa cadet family that was technically not legally allowed to inherit the throne, but he was seen as representing the traditional elements of Japan in a time of opening. However, politics in Edo were not driven by the whims of the rural daimyos. Instead, in the interim, the daimyo of the relatively small han of Hikone was granted control of the government. He was a shogun stooge by the name of Lee Naosuke, and was elevated to the position of Tairo with the passing of Shogun Ieyasu. This put him in a position to control the entire shogunal bureaucracy in Edo, which he did for his entire 2 years in the position. Naosuke's behind-the-scenes machinations saw the elevation of a 12-year-old Tokugawa Iemochi to the shogun's position, in defiance of the calls for Yoshinobu to succeed. Iemochi, only 12 at the time and never expected to become shogun, was impressionable and easy to manipulate by the deceitful head bureaucrat Naosuke and his successors. Although Naosuke was never officially shogun, he was de facto in control of the shogunal machine during this time, leading to widespread outcry of corruption and, of course, Sonno. Naosuke violently clamped down against anti-shogun Sonno protests, leading to brutal purges and crackdowns on dissent, which further inflamed the situation. Lee would also sign the 1858 US-Japan Treaty of Amity and Commerce, providing further safeguards for Western commercial interests in Japanese ports, and extending extraterritoriality to all American citizens on the islands. But most controversially for the Sonno adherents, Lee did so without even so much as consulting with the emperor. The flames of revolution were fanned ever further. As Coldrake puts it, regarding the signing of the 1858 treaty, quote, Lee's decision and its results split the nation in two, satisfying neither. Joy supporters were morally offended and the Sonno agitators forced to redefine their goals, becoming in the process a recognizable movement in the modern political sense. The supporters of Kaikoku, open the country, for their part, resented the sense of expediency and compulsion accompanying the final decision. End quote. The period of shogunal decline and agitation perfectly complemented and reinforced Yoshida Shoin's teachings in his small schoolhouse in Choshu. It was during these years that Shoin's rhetoric became increasingly radical and explicitly anti-shogun, or as he put it at the time, quote, the shogun disobeys the imperial command. The shogun is a national criminal, end quote. He extolled a vision of a reformed Japanese empire under an enlightened and reasonable emperor, as it was meant to be. At the time, Choshu was dominated by Sonno activists, all the way up from the daimyo himself, Mori Takachika, who had known Shoin since he was a child, and all the way down to the lowly peasant farmer. All wanted to see the shogun dismissed and the return of the emperor. The legacy of the small schoolhouse and the radical pro-emperor teacher would materialize within the cohort of students under his roof during the last years of his life. Shoin's cohort of young political upstarts would lead to many researchers characterizing his Shokusanjuku Academy as a sort of incubator for the future Meiji Restoration, the restoration of the emperor as the public-facing supreme leader of Japan. While Shoin's rhetoric was rising in radicalism and popularity, Lee Naosuke, the real power broker during this period, ordered the Ansei Purge, which oversaw the rooting out of dissidents across Japan, but with a special emphasis on the Choshu domain, the first of many such purges and expeditions. Shoin would get caught up in the sweep, especially as his agitation from house arrest continued to gain prominence. During this period, Shoin used proxies, mostly his students, to distribute his work and message in the country's core. In this sense, Shoin was using his adherents as intelligence assets to not only spread his propaganda regarding imperial supremacy and anti-foreigner sentiments, but also to gather information on the ground in the imperial capital. In 1858, according to Coldrake, he sent two of his most promising students, Katsura Kogoro and Kusaka Genzui, to Kyoto to report on the developments there. Katsura Kogoro is better known by his later adopted name, Kido Takayoshi, one of the three so-called great nobles of the Restoration. The other, Kusaka Genzui, was one of Choshu's most promising warriors, who would die in 1864, fighting for Choshu interests in the capital region. Kido Takayoshi in particular would be among the most prominent politicians of the early Meiji Restoration period, lauded as one of the fathers of modern Japan. It was not only Kido who would reach such heights following his time in Shoin study. Alongside him at the Shokusanjuku were a young Ito Hirobumi and a young Yamagata Aritomo, the two most powerful figures in the Meiji oligarchy all the way into the early 20th century. Ito and Aritomo, both Choshu men, will become major figures in this history, and importantly, they got their start under Yoshida Shoin in Choshu domain. They would carry Shoin's emperor worship and militaristic vision to the top of the new Japanese state. Yet the whole expel the barbarians part of the equation was conveniently swept under the rug. Alongside his musings about the emperor and Japan as the land of the gods, Shoin was also obsessed with the notion of death, specifically as it related to the samurai code. In Japan, to control one's death was the greatest expression of control on life. The ultimate act of freedom, as expressed in the Bushido code followed by the samurai, was to choose to take one's own life. This ritual suicide was known as seppuku, As Coldrake puts it, seppuku, quote, symbolizes the ultimate instrument of self-control and display of one's responsibilities to society, and one's final gesture of independence, end quote. Shoin described his view on seppuku quite bluntly, stating, quote, I discovered that the way of the samurai is death. In a life or death crisis, simply settle it by choosing immediate death, end quote. This sentiment cemented itself into Japanese society at large. Shoin would be deprived of a samurai's death, as he had abandoned his title 9 years earlier when he left Choshu on his pilgrimage throughout Japan. As the Ansei purges swept the country, Lord Mori of Choshu was ordered by Lee Naosuke in April 1859 during a visit to Edo to ship Shoin to the capital for imprisonment. Once there, Shoin confessed to assassination plots that he had been attributed to, specifically targeting Lee Naosuke and his entourage. In November, it was his turn to face punishment for his crimes, and he was decapitated in a courtyard adjacent to the shogunal prison. Yoshida Shoin's death made him a martyr to the growing throngs of Sonno activists across the country. One such figure was the aforementioned Ito Hirobumi, who would one day be the first prime minister of Japan. Ito buried his master near the execution site. Shoin's final words were recorded by the prison authorities. His death statement was one that served as an appropriate omen for things to come. Facing the chopping block, Shoin stated the following, quote, I am now to die for the sake of the country, but in dying, my loyalty to the emperor is not defeated. Calmly, I become a thing of the emperor, end quote. Less than 6 months later, in March 1860, the administrator-dictator Lee Naosuke would finally be killed by 17 samurai assassins after 20 months of near total control of Japan. This event marked one of the potential beginning points of the seemingly inevitable Meiji Restoration, the return of the Yamato emperors as the true rulers of Japan. Yoshida Shoin, dead at 29, missed the fruition of the Sonno movement that he had influenced so greatly. Japan was about to enter one of its most unstable periods, leading to the emergence of the modern Japanese state. The emperor throughout this period in Kyoto was known as Komei, a fairly obscure figure before the Sonno movement kicked off. If anything, Komei resembled the line of caged emperors before him, reacting to the ongoing turmoil with marked disinterest. Komei responded to the cries of restoration with a stern message of support for the shogun and the status quo. A little over 2 years after Lee Naosuke's assassination in 1860, the 16-year-old shogun took an unprecedented step and visited Komei in his palace in Kyoto, where he promised to repel the foreigners and to restore good governance to Japan. According to the Seagraves in their book, The Yamato Dynasty, Emperor Komei was thrilled by the shogun's unorthodox visit, and at the same time, they finalized an engagement between the young shogun Iemochi and the emperor's sister, Princess Kazu, essentially tying both the Tokugawa shogunate and the imperial house together in marriage. Iemochi took the emperor's sister as his wife, and returned to Edo hoping that the recent diplomatic trip to the imperial capital would help temper the growing loyalist movement. In reality, Iemochi's marriage into the imperial family only further enraged the Sonno forces, with them turning on Emperor Komei as a traitor to their cause. The activists instead turned their focus towards the emperor's son, as a vessel for their political cause, the young Mutsuhito, later to be canonized as the Meiji Emperor. 1860s Japan was marked by near-constant violence, terrorism, and inter-clan rivalry. The Ansei Purge and subsequent death of Lee Naosuke threw the entire country into a tailspin that would culminate in a civil war by the end of the decade. Back in the southwest of the country, the Choshu and Satsuma clans, historic rivals, both sought to overthrow the shogun but differed in their overall vision of a future Japan, at least at first. The Satsuma domain of Kyushu, under the control of daimyo Shimazu Tadayoshi, had been the major benefactors of the country's opening in 1854. The southern island of Kyushu, where they were based, was the trading center of choice for Western merchants, especially given the history of Western trading at the treaty port in Nagasaki. Even before official opening, the Satsuma clan got rich by buying contraband guns from European traders and selling them to the rest of the country, accumulating massive profits in the process. This also made Satsuma the second most powerful power in Japan next to the shogun. It would take some time, but the Satsuma domain eventually joined the calls to reinstall the emperor as their vehicle to power in Edo, but they were not convinced that the country needed to be shuttered again. Perry's opening had worked out great for them so far, and it was on this point that the Choshu disagreed. Besides generations-long feuds and grudges, the samurai of the far more agrarian and traditional Choshu domain did truly advocate for the closing of the country and the expulsion of the so-called barbarians. Old clan beefs came to a head in August 1864 with the Kinmon or Hamaguri Gate incident, wherein the Choshu clan sent its most fierce warriors to Kyoto to attempt to seize one of the palace's forbidden gates for their own. There, they were met by Satsuma and Aizu troops, ready to defend the imperial palace from the rebels. Coldrake describes the event as so. Quote, "The incident with its appalling loss of life and wasted talent and official condemnation of Choshu as an enemy of the state was more truly a watershed in Japanese history than either the arrival of Perry's ships off of Uragahama in 1853 or the assassination of Lee Naosuke in March 1860. Kinmon no Ran, or the Hamaguri Gate incident is what she's referring to here, was more than an isolated affair such as some of the previous skirmishes between Sonno factions and Bakufu supporters in Kyoto had been. It marked the turning point of public opinion in Kyoto against Choshu, and Choshu's acceptance of a humiliating defeat in clan politics." End quote. The Hamaguri Gate incident remains shrouded in uncertainty. The most straightforward explanation is that this event represented a flare-up of old clan rivalries, with the Choshus attempting to stake their claim on the Hamaguri Gate of the imperial palace in Kyoto. The shogun bestowed the honor of defending gates of the imperial palace to sympathetic clans across Japan, as a means to keep them within his orbit of control. Choshu had no such privileges, and thus tried to seize a gate by force. In late summer of 1864, bands of Choshu militias met with Sonno forces in Kyoto, ready to storm the gate. Some claimed that the Choshu clan planned to kidnap the emperor and to bring him back to Hagi Castle as a hostage, until the shogun stepped down. Many of Yoshida Shoin's most promising students died during the Hamaguri incident, wiping out a significant retinue of Choshu samurai in the process. Coldrake claims that over 400 Choshu men died over those days of turmoil, as Choshu was declared an official imperial enemy. It has also been said that the Hamaguri Gate incident saw the end of the Sonno movement, although it remained influential in spirit in the upcoming civil war. Those Choshu men who did survive the incident, largely due to happenstance, would be the ones to lead the new government of Japan after the Restoration would come to an end in the late 1860s. Kido Takayoshi, for example, one of the so-called great nobles of the Restoration, hid away at his mistress's house during the violence, dodging an early death. Ito Hirobumi, the future first Prime Minister of Japan, was studying in London, England at the time, avoiding the bloodshed as well. Yamagata Aritomo, the father of the Japanese army and another Shoin student, was also not present. As Coldrake asserts, the leading men of Choshu would rise to the upper ranks of the new Japanese government, almost more so by chance than by great virtue. Japan's near-constant turmoil was not lost on the European powers, who watched as the country descended into civil war with apprehension and opportunism. The widespread anti-foreigner sentiments were not an ideal reaction for the Westerners trying to crack into the famously isolationist Japanese economy. The recent Shimonoseki campaign of 1863 and 64, which immediately preceded the Hamaguri Gate incident, saw the always militant Choshu domain seize the ever-important straits between Honshu and Kyushu, firing on all foreign ships that tried to pass. Daimyo Mori Takachika ordered for several cannons to be placed on the beach, ready to fire if any European ships tried to enter Japan's inland sea. This led to a series of bombardments of Choshu by American, French, British, and Dutch ships. This flashpoint in Shimonoseki enraged most Western observers, except for a few shrewd British financial interests that saw the Choshu's fighting spirit and devout loyalty to the caged emperor as an opportunity. One such man would be recognized later as one of the most significant European players in the history of early modern Japan, He was an Anglo-Scotsman by the name of Thomas Blake Glover, and he saw the Choshus and their rivals, the Satsumas in Kyushu, as potential allies to the British Crown, which was increasingly eyeing Japan as a potential ally in East Asia. During the latter half of the 1800s, the British Empire was engaged in a protracted cold conflict with Russia over dominance in Asia, centered primarily on Central Asia. The region roughly comprising Persia in the west all the way to Afghanistan in the east. This would come to be known as the Great Game, a simmering colonial conflict between British and Russian proxies over dominance of the ever-critical Silk Road region. At first glance, this famous rivalry seems completely unrelated to Japan, as they were half a world away in the Pacific, a far cry from the deserts and steppes of Central Asia. To the British, however, Japan seemed like a potentially useful ally in the ongoing campaign. Given Japan's proximity to Russia on their Pacific front, Britain speculated that Japan could be used as a potential proxy to eventually open a second offensive against Russia from the east. Japan, for their part, would soon find themselves embroiled in a multitude of land disputes with the neighboring Russians, first over the Siberian islands of Sakhalin, and later, famously, over Port Arthur and Manchuria. This confluence of interests brought many British travelers to view Japan as a natural ally in the evolving Great Game. Thomas Blake Glover, arguably the foremost British trader in Japan in the 1860s, read the tea leaves accurately, and saw that the British Crown had much to gain from the escalating civil war there. Glover had first arrived in Japan in 1859, crossing from Shanghai to Nagasaki. In Shanghai, Glover had been an agent of Jardine Matheson, the largest Anglo-Scottish trading house in China. Jardine Matheson was famously a major player in the British opium trade, selling massive amounts of the drug to Chinese addicts and playing a significant role in instigating both opium wars. Glover's connections to Jardine Matheson followed him to Nagasaki, where in 1859 he began a business of selling Japanese green tea to European merchants, eventually forming the company Glover & Co. The House of Jardine Matheson had been the first European firm to establish a headquarters in Japan, building their first offices in Yokohama in 1859, the same year that Glover also made the trek over. This was enabled by the signing of treaties between Japan and the Western powers in 1858. The first was with the Americans, known as the Harris Treaty, and the others were with the European powers, known collectively as the Ansei Treaties, which effectively opened the Japanese economy to Western trading houses for the first time outside of the small treaty port in Nagasaki. Jardine Matheson chose Yokohama for their base of operations as it was situated just southwest of the capital on Edo Bay. In this contemporary woodblock painting of Yokohama from above, we can note Jardine's headquarters as the only Western-styled building right next to the port. They were awarded the address of Foreign Building No. 1 as the first tenants in the newly opened foreign district of the city. Following shortly thereafter was Thomas Blake Glover, who also headed for Nagasaki in 1859. It was likely not a coincidence that a former Jardine Matheson agent would travel to Japan the very same year that his former company did as well. From his vantage point at the very south of the islands in the Kyushu city of Nagasaki, Glover witnessed firsthand the significant unrest brewing in the disaffected Satsuma and Choshu domains. As the Sonno chants continued to fill the streets and anti-foreigner sentiments erupted with the Shimonoseki Straits campaign, Glover did not lose sight of the great opportunity for the British Crown in this rebellious current. Glover & Co. quickly emerged as a major arms supplier to the Satsuma domain of Kyushu, with the Japanese soon nicknaming him the so-called Merchant of Death. According to the book Samurai Revolution, Glover would be responsible for the import of some 500,000 rifles into Nagasaki and eventually Yokohama in the last 3 years of the shogun's rule. He would come to form a special relationship with the Satsuma clan, able to circumvent shogunal boycotts on the import of Western weaponry through Nagasaki. Witnessing firsthand the rapid militarization of the Satsuma and Choshu clans in the face of brutal suppression by the Tokugawa shogun in Edo, Glover concluded that it was these patriotic firebrands, and not the outdated feudal shogun, that would usher Japan into modernity. Not to mention, it was these clans who were buying the weaponry he had for sale, and it was these Hans that were in the process of modernizing their military, not only in terms of weaponry, but also in terms of organization and military sciences. Although Glover and Co. traded primarily with the powerful Satsuma clan of Kyushu, the second largest Han in Japan after the Shoguns in Edo, his real interest lay with the adjacent Choshu clan, the central figures of our drama today. Whereas the Satsuma clan was often ambivalent towards the shogun from their privileged position as major importers of Western goods, the Choshus by the early 1860s had become sworn enemies to the central government in Edo, officially so by 1864, as we saw with the Hamaguri Gate incident. Choshu also produced some of Japan's most promising administrators and bureaucrats, many being former students of the martyred professor Yoshida Shoin. In turn, their domain quickly rationalized its bureaucracy and army throughout the Civil War, pleasing Western observers such as Glover, who saw the potential. Whereas Satsuma had wealth and Western goods, Choshu had administrative expertise, radical politics, and a deeply ingrained warrior spirit that coursed throughout its society. Glover's fascination with the Choshu clan led him to take an unprecedented step in 1863, organizing the second foreign delegation from Japan to Great Britain and Europe as a whole. Glover's foreign delegation came to be known as the Choshu Five and are on screen now. The shrewd trader organized the passage of these 5 young Choshu administrators to London on a Jardine Matheson ship. They were disguised as British sailors, so as to not attract undue attention or backlash from anti-Western activists, and spirited off across the world to be groomed into useful assets by the British establishment. Once in England, the Japanese visitors were taken into the care of Hugh Matheson, the nephew of Glover's former boss James Matheson, the co-founder, alongside William Jardine, of the titular shipping firm. Hugh Matheson also worked as a merchant engaged in the so-called China trade, but refused to join his uncle's business, citing their extensive role in the opium trade as the major reason for his refusal. The 5 Choshu men stayed in London for most of their trip, where all 5 were enrolled at University College London. They were all taught to speak English and attended classes in practical sciences, skills that would surely come in use when industrializing Japan over the next decades. They all attended chemistry lectures given by Professor Alexander Williamson, a good friend of Hugh Matheson's. 3 of the Choshu men stayed with Williamson at his house in London, and his wife tutored them in English after school hours. It was in this environment that Japan's future was being shaped, not by the emerging civil war in their home country, but by the conniving nation builders under the Jardine Matheson umbrella. The 2 most prominent members among the Choshu Five group were the aforementioned Ito Hirobumi and his close personal associate Inoue Kaoru. Both former students of Yoshida Shoin, Ito and Inoue would both remain prominent players in the new Japanese state after the fall of the shogunate in 1868. Ito, as I already mentioned, would serve 4 times as prime minister, including being the first to do so, while Inoue would hold several top cabinet positions including foreign minister, minister of home affairs, and the Ministry of Finance position for a short stint. All of the Choshu Five would come to play some role in the modernization of Japan, but Ito and Inoue towered over the rest. Besides elevating them to the international stage and imbuing them with the skills needed for Japan's upcoming modernization, the Choshu Five were spared from the ongoing strife taking place in Japan, specifically to their Choshu brothers during this same period. During the last year of their visit to Europe, from September to November 1864, the Tokugawa shogunate launched the first of 2 Choshu expeditions, a planned, uncompromising show of force by the central government against the rebels in the southwest. As an act of revenge against the clan for the whole Hamaguri Gate fiasco in August of 1864, the Tokugawa forces and its allies, including the forces of the rival Satsuma and Aizu domains, descended on the Choshu Han. Leading the 150,000-man army towards the southwest was a Satsuma samurai by the name of Saigo Takamori. As Hillsborough puts it in his book, Samurai Revolution, Saigo, quote, led the call for the complete destruction of the Choshu, end quote. Saigo Takamori was becoming a sensation on his home island of Kyushu. Described variously by Sterling and Peggy Seagrave as a, quote, big-hearted samurai, and by a fellow samurai Nakoka Shintaro as, quote, the greatest man in Western Japan, and, quote, learned, courageous, and usually quiet, but when he does occasionally utter a few words, they are filled with utmost resolution and depth of thought which penetrate the listener's heart, end quote. Of all the players in this ongoing theater, Saigo was arguably the most admirable. Coming from a long line of Satsuma samurais, he came to devote his life to an almost messianic anti-corruption drive. In 1864, the loyal Saigo was still standing by the increasingly desperate shogun, chosen strategically to lead the forces against Choshu. Long-standing grievances between both clans and the recent disloyalty towards the shogun shown by the Choshu hardliners had made Satsuma's Saigo Takamori seemingly the perfect leader of such a punitive expedition. As he noted in a September 1864 letter to fellow Satsuma administrator Okubo Toshimichi, quote, Choshu must be punished by military force, and once it surrenders, its domain must be drastically reduced in size and moved eastward, closer to Edo. Otherwise, Satsuma, and indeed the entire Japanese nation, will face disaster. End quote. As the shogun's forces accumulated in Osaka to prepare for the journey west, the samurai commander Saigo was pulled into a meeting that would change his trajectory in life to both heroic and tragic ends. Saigo was sought out by a shogunal naval officer by the name of Katsu Kaishu to discuss the ongoing Choshu expedition. Reportedly, the meeting between the gentle-hearted Satsuma samurai Saigo and the Tokugawa political operator Kaishu in Osaka right before the Choshu expedition had dramatic ramifications not only on the ongoing expedition, but on the future of Tokugawa Japan as a whole. On the night of September 11, 1864, Kaishu stunned Saigo when he treacherously lectured the samurai on the continued decadence and corruption displayed by the Tokugawa government in Edo. As Hillsborough put it, quote, he said that the Bakufu was rotten to the core and no longer capable of governing, and their greatest concern was the welfare of the Bakufu, which they complacently believed safeguarded their own comfort and safety, end quote. He painted a picture of Japan falling into civil war, and in the ensuing chaos, being cut into pieces by the Western powers, able to operate at their own will in the instability. Finally, he proposed to Saigo that he organize a confederation of 4 or 5 feudal domains that could rightfully rule Japan not from the illegitimate seat of shogunal power in Edo, but from the rightful place by the emperor in Kyoto. This meeting was instrumental in laying the groundwork for what would become the so-called Sacho Alliance, an unprecedented alliance between the often warring Choshu and Satsuma domains. In a letter sent after the meeting in Osaka to his compatriot Okubo Toshimichi back in Satsuma, he expressed his surprise at how persuasive Kaishu's lecture had been. He claimed regarding the naval officer, quote, he is certainly an amazing man. At first I had intended to really tear into him, but instead, I bowed my head in reverence. There's really no telling just how resourceful he is. I am terribly taken by Katsu-sensei. End quote. This letter is especially significant as we have the last 2 of the 3 major figures of the upcoming Meiji Restoration present in this interaction. Throughout Japanese history, and as we will come to see in upcoming events, there seemed to be a consistent emphasis placed on chosen trios, triumvirates of men who changed and would change Japan in the future. Going back even to the 16th century, we can see triplet figures such as the 3 great unifiers of Japan, the 3 men who ultimately established the Tokugawa shogunate that would last until the late 1860s. Here, in the 19th century, the 3 men were known as the Great Nobles of the Restoration, for their key role and prominent national figure status during the ongoing Japanese Civil War and eventual reinstatement of Emperor Meiji as the popular ruler of Japan. These 3 men will be familiar to you all by now, especially as immortalized in the aforementioned letter. One was from Choshu, the charming reformer Kido Takayoshi, whom Sterling and Peggy Seagrave nicknamed the Pen, for his eloquent writing and his central role in the early Meiji bureaucracy. The 2 others were from Satsuma clan, the jolly samurai Saigo Takamori, whom the Seagraves nickname the Sword, and his pen pal back in Satsuma, the shrewd and deceitful Okubo Toshimichi, whom they nickname appropriately the Despot. The three great nobles' role in upcoming events cannot be understated, yet their influence was short-lived. All three would die early, within a year of each other, between 1877 and 78, leaving the Meiji administration in newly renamed Tokyo to those who were lucky enough to survive. Nonetheless, these three men led the charge against the shogun, and precipitated the course towards Japanese modernization. Following his spontaneous meeting with Kaishu in Osaka, Saigo decided that it was in Satsuma's best interest to cease hostilities with Choshu. Internal strife was such in Choshu itself that the well-meaning samurai decided that a punitive campaign was not necessary. The shogun's first Choshu expedition ended without bloodshed, as Choshu agreed to surrender its major dissidents to Saigo and to end open opposition towards Edo, at least for now. Anticlimactically, the whole campaign came to an end, but not before word made it to London to the Choshu Five, studying at University College London, that Choshu was now considered an enemy of the shogun following the clash in Kyoto in August 1864. Shocked by the development, the five Choshu men cut their sojourn in Europe short and made the journey back to Japan in time for the upcoming Boshin War. The alliance between Choshu and Satsuma clans, which was formalized in 1866, would have been unimaginable only a decade earlier. As the Tokugawa shogunate continued its brutal repression of dissidents, even the once loyal Satsuma clan began to be swayed against them. Clever diplomacy by the Choshu, led by Kido Takayoshi, had an impact, but as is the case in so much history, the entrance of an otherwise unremarkable character would cement the alliance that would see the fall of the shogun, a little over 2 years later. His name was Sakamoto Ryoma, and he was originally from the Tosa domain on Shikoku, the smallest of the four main Japanese islands, situated in the inland sea. From a wealthy samurai family that lived in Kochi Castle in Tosa, Ryoma could be considered a class traitor, as from an early age he rejected the rigid class hierarchy in the Tosa domain, and by extension Japan as a whole. As a young man, he renounced his samurai status, becoming a ronin, or a samurai without a master, and moved to the shogunal capital in Edo to train at a dojo there. As so many young Japanese activists were, Ryoma was further radicalized by the arrival of Commodore Perry's black ships, which he witnessed firsthand in Edo. As Hillsborough puts it in Samurai Revolution, quote, "Like most young men of Tosa's lower samurai caste, and their counterparts in Satsuma and Choshu, he was disgusted with the Bakufu for not fulfilling its obligation to protect the empire and the rest of the country from the barbarians." End quote. From this point on, Ryoma joined the Sonno cause and became a political agitator. A pacifist at heart, he saw the decline of the shogun as an opportunity for a peaceful restoration of the Yamato emperors and a wide-scale reformation of Japan's backwards land ownership and title system. As Hillsborough puts it again, quote, "Ryoma's ultimate objective then would be the bloodless overthrow of the Bakufu to usher in the modern age, preserving national sovereignty against Western imperialism." End quote. In 1862, Ryoma set aside his pacifist tendencies for a moment and planned to assassinate a top Tokugawa shogunate official, the aforementioned Katsu Kaishu, the same man who would convince Saigo Takamori to call off the first Choshu expedition. Before his secret turn against the shogun, Katsu was seen by Sonno activists as the embodiment of the corrupt open-door policy brought on by the shogunate. He had started his career as a naval cadet, selected by the Dutch delegation in Kyushu to train at the Nagasaki Naval Academy in the mid-1850s. Katsu in turn became one of the first modern navy captains in Japan, serving as the captain of the Dutch-built Janrin Maru, the first Japanese ship to sail to the west. To the Sonno throngs, Katsu Kaishu became the public face of Japan's opening to the barbarians, and Ryoma set his sights on bringing him to an end. When the young Ronin approached Katsu sometime in 1862, events transpired that maybe could only happen in the bizarre world of Japanese politics at the time. Katsu Kaishu not only convinced Ryoma to spare him, but also to become his protege at the Naval Academy in Kobe, just across the inland sea from his home in Tosa domain on Shikoku. In a similar pitch that he would give to Saigo 2 years later, he argued that Japan needed to modernize to ever have a chance at expelling the barbarians for good, and that Western weaponry was the best tool to reach that end. Beyond simply being a master navigator and sailor, Kaishu was, as he revealed, an expert political operator. Likely he saw the writing on the wall regarding the shogun, and although he remained loyal to the Tokugawas on the outside, his taking in of Ryoma seemed to indicate that he was ready to hedge his bets and play both sides of the upcoming civil war. As Ryoma worked under Kaishu in Kobe, he heard reports of the Hamaguri Gate incident, the subsequent slaughter of Choshu men, and the compromise reached between the Choshus and the Satsumas. Like many others in Japan, Sakamoto Ryoma correctly estimated that the overthrow of the shogun would be brought on by an alliance of clans from the technologically advanced and disciplined southwestern clans. By 1865, the 19-year-old shogun Tokugawa Iemochi was already devising a second Choshu expedition, which would once and for all bring an end to the Choshu's warring spirit. At least that was the idea. With the second expedition announced on March 6, 1865, anti-shogun activists across Japan looked on with disgust at the continued repression of opposing clans. Ryoma, for his part, was also outraged by the announcement. As he put it, quote, "The only ones with the power to change things are Satsuma and Choshu. There's bad blood between them now, but I intend to get them together. There is no sound logic behind launching a second expedition against Choshu." End quote. From there, Ryoma set out for the Shimonoseki Straits region to attempt to mediate a strategic alliance between the two rival Hans. As we know now, this fateful trip would put into motion the events that would lead to the end of the Tokugawa shoguns. First, Ryoma went to Kyushu to meet with Satsuma leaders. Although he personally had few ties to the southwest, he was able to leverage his mentor Katsu Kaishu's connections at the Nagasaki Naval Academy to secure meetings with top men. This was already 1 year after Saigo and Kaishu's fateful meeting in Osaka, so there was precedent to Ryoma's mission. He stayed at Saigo Takamori's house for 16 days in May of 1865, where the golden-hearted samurai confirmed that the Satsuma clan would stand against the shogun, especially in face of the second Choshu expedition, which was seen as a step too far, even for the rivals in Satsuma. Besides meeting with Satsuma's leaders, Ryoma was also instrumental in establishing Japan's first ever import-export firm, which became known as Kameyama Shachu, or the Kameyama Company. It was staffed primarily by friends of Katsu Kaishu's at the Nagasaki Naval Academy. The Kameyama Company worked to secretly import Western armaments, ships, and cannons to supply the belligerent Choshu and Satsuma armies. As an aside here, it is noteworthy that Ryoma was the creator of Japan's first trading house, given he was from Tosa Domain, which would be home to one of Japan's largest corporations throughout its entire modern history, that being Mitsubishi. Only 2 years after the fall of the shogunate in 1870, Iwasaki Yataro would found the Tsukumo Shokai, which would eventually become the now ubiquitous Mitsubishi Group, one of Meiji Japan's 4 major zaibatsus, the 4 state oligopolies. Even Mitsubishi's modern logo reflects its Tosa clan origins, with the logo mirroring the Tosa's emblem in appearance. We will get into the zaibatsus much more in the next part, but for now I want to note that Yataro worked under Ryoma Sakamoto in Nagasaki as one of his associates at the Kameyama Company. In this sense, the creation of Mitsubishi was inspired by Ryoma's entrepreneuring activities during the Civil War. On that same current, the Tosa domain in Shikoku can be pinpointed as one of the origin points of Japanese corporatism. As it had it, Choshu had already laid the groundwork for their procurement of guns through their long-standing sponsor, Jardine Matheson man Thomas Blake Glover. Having now spent 7 years in Japan, Glover had become a mainstay in southwest Japan and had continued to influence the ensuing events from the shadows. For example, following the return of the Choshu Five from London in 1865, Glover was approached by a promising young Choshu samurai about arranging his own voyage to Europe to learn military tactics. His name was Takasugi Shinsaku, and was yet another former student of Yoshida Shoin. Shinsaku was a major militia leader in Choshu and one of its most promising military strategists. Glover saw this and understood that in the upcoming civil war, Shinsaku would be more valuable in Choshu and not halfway across the world in Great Britain. So Glover convinced Shinsaku to stay behind and to wait until after the fighting had stopped to make his European tour. The militia leader took Thomas Glover's advice and stayed in Choshu. He'd never see Europe in his lifetime, as he'd die a year later in 1867 fighting in the Boshin Wars. Again, a consistent theme throughout this saga was the wanton loss of life, especially of Choshu men. The fortunate survivors would be the ones, not by virtue, but by chance, to rule post-Shogun Japan. Glover was more than willing to import weapons for Choshu, but there was just one problem. The import of foreign weapons was still illegal under Bakufu law. Any hint that the Choshu were secretly smuggling in weapons would surely expedite the brewing Second Choshu expedition. Luckily, Sakamoto Ryoma, the mediator, was 2 steps ahead of them. His plan was simple. The Satsuma and Choshu clans would form an alliance of convenience, wherein the Choshu would acquire the much-needed weaponry via Thomas Blake Glover, using his newly formed Kameyama company as a secret conduit. Everyone was technically acting illegally in this scheme, but Satsuma had a unique, special relationship with European traders, which allowed them to discreetly import goods outside of the purview of the shogun in Edo. They were then to be smuggled in the night on one of Satsuma's ships, the Kochomaru, arriving safely on the north coast of Choshu. The Choshu clan acquired some 7,000 rifles through this Glover connection, 4,000 of which were brand new Minié rifles. The Minié rifled musket had been used by the British Army from 1851 to 55. These 4,000 Miniés that ended up in Choshu would be a deciding factor in the upcoming war against the shogun's forces. Glover was also able to supply the Choshu clan with their first steamer, a British-built ship known as the Union. Although it was owned by the Choshu clan in reality, Hillsborough notes that it was registered under the Satsuma clan, and even flew the Shimazu cross, the emblem of Satsuma. These were highly illegal moves by the Choshu clan. Every precaution had to be taken. But still, even with all these secret weapons transfers, negotiations, and compromises, the Choshu and Satsuma clan were not officially allied yet. Interestingly, it was the Choshu who were most hesitant to initiate talks. Ryoma had completely convinced Saigo and Okubo, the 2 Satsuma great nobles, that an alliance with the Choshu was vital to their collective survival. Still, Choshu's pride and devotion to the samurai death principle paralyzed them in diplomacy. As written in the book Samurai Revolution, when Sakamoto Ryoma pressed Choshu statesman Kido Takayoshi to initiate talks of an alliance with the Satsumas, Kido claimed the following, quote, "If I were to propose an alliance, it would be like begging Satsuma to have pity on us and inviting them to share our danger. Better to fight the Bakufu," he said, "and if Choshu should be defeated and all that remains of the domain is scorched earth, as long as Satsuma survives to serve the imperial country, we would have no regrets." End quote. Frustrated, Ryoma was convinced that the alliance would need to be initiated by the Satsuma, and likely by Saigo, the pure-hearted samurai. Which is exactly what happened. On January 22, 1866, in Kyoto, after 2 days of secret talks, Saigo Takamori and Kido Takayoshi signed the Sacho Alliance, officially uniting the forces of both clans during the upcoming conflict. From there, events moved quicker as the shogunate came to crumble over the next 2 years. In June 1866, Tokugawa Iemochi finally launched the Second Choshu expedition, with the bombardment of several Choshu ports. The shogun himself followed the war party as it made its way through Japan towards the southwest of the country. During a stopover in Osaka, disaster struck. Tokugawa Iemochi died suddenly at Osaka Castle at 20 years old. Not much is written on his cause of death. The suspicious timing of his perishing does imply that foul play could have played a role. Either way, the shogun was dead, and replaced by the 29-year-old Tokugawa Yoshinobu, the original candidate favored by the Choshu clan. The expedition to Choshu proceeded regardless, and turned out to be a complete disaster for the Tokugawa soldiers. They had not expected the Choshu soldiers to be equipped with brand new European rifles, which quickly decimated their lines of pike and sword-wielding infantry. The decisive victory for Choshu and Satsuma only further fueled their military ambitions. Soon the rebel army swept across Japan, picking up sympathetic recruits along the way. Tosa domain, for example, soon enough joined the imperial faction alongside several other daimyos across Japan. The war went on until 1869 and is known as the Boshin War, or alternatively, the Japanese Civil War. The desperate shogun Yoshinobu tried one final maneuver to try to turn the tide against the Satsuma Choshu army. He turned to the French for military assistance, which they happily offered. Remember, the rebellion was largely successful thanks to British meddling and statecraft. The French, long-standing rivals of Great Britain, saw this as a potential opportunity to counter their opponents' play in Asia. This last-ditch effort was too little, too late, though. By the time the French army instructors arrived in Edo in 1867, they only had time to arm and train a relatively small retinue of elite shock troops known as the Den-Shutai. These were the most feared shogunal forces on the battlefield by far, but they were not numerous enough to really tilt the scale. After the decisive victory at the Battle of Koshu Katsunuma by imperial forces, Commander Saigo Takamori led his troops to neighboring Edo and surrounded the city in April of 1868. With nowhere to hide or fight, the shogun, already a lame duck since his formal resignation in November of 1867, surrendered the city, signaling the climactic fall of the shogunate. The official unconditional surrender was delivered by lead negotiator Katsu Kaishu, the man who had mentored Sakamoto Ryoma, the architect of the Sacho alliance. His pupil Ryoma had died during the fighting in 1867 of an assassination, one of the thousands of deaths of prominent samurai throughout the war. Saigo and Kaishu devised the terms of the surrender. Remember, Kaishu was a secret sympathizer to the imperial cause. He was essentially a loyal mole within the Tokugawa bureaucracy. So soon enough, Saigo and Kaishu had finalized their negotiations. Edo was renamed to Tokyo, meaning Eastern Capital. The emperor was to leave his imperial palace at Kyoto and take up residency in the new eastern capital, Tokyo. Everything seemed to fall into place for the imperial rebels. As it had it, Emperor Komei, the aloof traditionalist emperor, died in 1867, a year before the war came to an end. Taking the throne was his 15-year-old son, Mutsuhito, renamed in the imperial tradition to Meiji. The chosen candidate of the Sonno movement emerged as the new divine ruler of Japan, recognized and public. The Meiji Restoration was complete. Japan was now an empire again. And as we will see, the Meiji era would see the rise of Japan from feudal agrarianism to capitalist oligarchy, from katanas and samurais to steamers and industrial combines, and from centuries of isolation to becoming a veritable westernized colonial power. As always, thank you all so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this first chapter of the Making of Modern Japan series. If you did, please leave a like and a comment and let me know your thoughts down below. It helps with the algorithm and helps me to make better videos. First and foremost, I would like to thank all of my supporters on Patreon for making these videos possible. On screen now are all of my producer tier patrons who supported me throughout this Making of Modern Japan series. The video you just watched was first made available to them on September 2nd, 2025. If you wish to get early access to my content, get access to small Patreon bonus videos, and connect with me on a more personal level, please consider checking out my page on Patreon, linked below in the description. There you can find the entirety of the Making of Modern Japan series, and some other projects I am working on, including a 2-part series on Jeffrey Epstein and Robert Maxwell's scientific networks. I am writing the second part of that series now, using the recently released Epstein files as primary sources to better understand the nature and purpose of Epstein's wide-ranging scientific apparatus. So, if you want to watch the entire Making of Modern Japan series right now, or to listen to my first article on Robert Maxwell and Epstein, please check out my Patreon linked below. In 2 weeks, I will be uploading the second part of the Making of Modern Japan series, covering the destruction of the samurai and the rise of the Imperial Japanese Army. In this next chapter, I will be following the aforementioned 3 great nobles of the Restoration, as they shaped the early modern Japanese state during their short time at the top. The destruction of the samurai institution was the ultimate step in abolishing feudalism in Japan, and entailed significant strife and tensions that would remain present throughout their modernizing period. More on all that in 2 weeks. Anyway, that's all I've got for today. Thank you all for watching as always, and remember to always keep your eyes wide open. Take care.